believed she ought to do it. My life is about so much more than that, and I'm glad that you are here to let me share it with you. Yes, I was raised on a ranch on the prairies of Montana. I grew up independent. I was encouraged to think for myself. And when I went to the University of Montana, I got a degree in biology. Now, what in the world was I going to do with that? It was becoming much more acceptable for women to get a college degree, but they weren't supposed to do anything with it. Getting a degree, perhaps, but a marriage, a family, that is what was expected of women. And while I might have been well suited for that, having grown up with a large family and knowing well how to run a household, I didn't want to do that. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I didn't want to do that. And then 2 trips that I took changed my course of action in this life. My brother, Wellington, was going to Harvard. And so I took a trip back east. And on one of the weekends, in my visit with him, we went to New York City. And this Montana prairie girl saw more things that she could never have imagined. Buildings that scraped the sky, they called it. And opulence, businesses, wealth in such abundance, I could hardly imagine it, on a place called Madison Avenue. But just a few blocks away, in a place called the Bowery, immigrants were living in tenement slums. Well, I wouldn't let my ranch animals live in such conditions. And I thought to myself, how can this be? Side by side in this big city. I didn't know that there was anything I could do about it. So I went home, but it certainly stuck in my mind. And then a couple of years later, 1907, I visited San Francisco. And I saw the same thing. That city was rebuilding after the earthquake the year before. And there it was again, so much of the wealth in the hands of just a few, rebuilding that city in the image that they felt they wanted. And right there next to it, the immigrants, people who had come to this country for a better life, and they had no access to those resources. I thought social work might be the thing for me, and I got some education in that, and then my first job at the Seattle Children's Home in Washington. I was no more than a glorified babysitter. Children were brought to us so broken in spirit and in health that no one wanted them. They might be returned after a year of being placed with a family, like so much baggage. And I couldn't help wondering, where are the laws protecting these children? Where are the laws that intervene in the circumstances that cause such a situation to begin with? And I realized that after a while, philanthropy and good intentions, they don't have any effect. If we're going to change things, we have to change the laws. And in order to change those laws, we have to have people voting for those laws who care about those things. And that would be the women who care about the home and the family and the community and the structure of this country. And that year, 1910, only 4 states had given women the right to vote. It just so happened, though, that the state of Washington was putting women's suffrage back on the ballot. And I decided I'd give that a try. And so I helped campaign for that. Helping people understand that keeping the issue single, just be about suffrage and against anti-suffrage, and try to have every voter at a grassroots level asked by some woman to please vote for that referendum. And don't you know, every county in the state of Washington passed women's suffrage. And the whole idea that women should have an amendment to our Constitution that would include them all as citizens, well, that took off. And there was no stopping it after that. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I no longer wondered what I was supposed to be doing with my life. And in the next few years, we saw many states come into the fold. Arizona, South Dakota, Ohio. my own home state of Montana, why I came here in 1911, suggesting that the legislature should consider women's suffrage. They weren't interested. They handed me a little bouquet of flowers and thanked me for my time. But in 1913, now they were interested. And so with some campaigning to the legislature, it was put on the ballot. And in 1914, indeed, the state of Montana enfranchised its women, not by very much, but at least it was another success. And I thought that I should be recognized by the National Association of Women Suffragists to be in a more elevated capacity, but they weren't interested in that. And I was frustrated. I was frustrated that it was taking so long. So I took a break. I backed away from the movement for a while. I traveled, I lectured. I went to New Zealand, of all places. But women had had the right to vote in New Zealand for 20 years. Nothing bad had happened to the country. In fact, there were laws protecting children from child labor situations, laws about education, laws about sanitation and hygiene. We needed that kind of participation in government in our country. And I thought, well, if women are half the people, they ought to be half the government, half the Congress. So I decided to run for Congress. And when I told my brother about that, he thought I meant state legislature. And I said, no, the Congress of the United States. And he wasn't sure I could pull that off. Of course, the Eastern suffragists, oh, they didn't want me to run. They said, Jeannette, if you run and fail, why, you'll set back our entire movement by decades. Montana would be a challenge. It's a big piece of land. The communities are far apart. And once you get to them, they're well politicized and well organized. I traveled over 6,000 miles that year to every home, every church, every jail, every place where someone would let me speak, hoping that people might open their minds and hearts to the idea that it's important that women have a voice in our government. On election day, after campaigning on a platform of preparedness for peace, there was a war going on in Europe. It was 1916. Americans didn't want anything to do with it. Preparedness for peace, votes for women, laws protecting women and children, and prohibition. I told Montanans that my first reason for seeking election was to further the cause of equal rights, equal suffrage, and that I wanted them to vote responsibly. Don't vote for the party just because it's a tradition for you. Find a candidate that's going to represent the ideas that you have and going to fight for the reforms that you want, and vote for that person. The previous Congress had voted $300,000 to study hog feed and $30,000 to study the needs of children. Well, if the nation's pigs are 10 times more important than the nation's children, then it's high time there was a woman in Congress to speak for them. There are plenty of people to take care of irrigation projects and foreign policy, but not a single woman to speak for those who have no voice. So on election day, I went to the polls, and the first vote I ever cast was a vote for myself. And then, of course, the waiting, which seemed interminable. Finally, at the end of the very election day, it was determined that I hadn't won. Well, I was disappointed, to be sure, but I told you that Montana is a very big piece of land. And it took 2 days to count the votes in the eastern counties. And when they were counted, well, the results changed. And I had taken that seat in Congress. And I was on my way to Washington. My first stop, however, was New York City. where I addressed those Eastern suffragists, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, those same people who didn't want to give me a position within their own ranks. I think they might have wanted someone else to be the first woman elected to Congress, maybe someone from their Eastern society, someone more educated or more highly placed in society. But they got me. And I never gave anyone any opportunity to think that I was frivolous or unprofessional or not completely serious about what I was up to going to Congress. When I addressed the group that day, I spoke about democracy in government, how we need more of it, more social democracy, more political democracy, more business democracy. What I didn't talk about was the war, and that is what was on everyone's mind. Americans were beginning to lose their apathy for it, probably because of the propaganda of the militarists. But still, as soon as I was elected, my friends and family started hounding me. Jeannette, if it comes to a vote, vote for war, vote like a man. Well, you can see the obvious problem with that. I'm not a man. And it also supposes that all men vote for war, and they don't. Oh, but Jeannette, if you don't vote for the war, you'll show that women are weak. Well, if you don't vote for the war, you'll show that women have no place in public life. They can't take it. If you don't vote for the war, you'll be making a needless sacrifice. You won't be reelected. Sacrifice, huh? My job in Congress would be the sacrifice I would make. Well, let's look at sacrifice differently. What about the towns that are destroyed, the communities? What about the young men who give their lives? That's sacrifice. I won't send a young man to war to save my job. Little good it will do to save democracy for the people if there aren't any people left for the democracy. Well, it was March of 1917, and I set off on a speaking tour. I didn't know there was going to be a session of Congress, but President Wilson called us all back to Washington, and we all knew why. But before that great cloud, that great dark cloud of war talk burst over the Capitol, I experienced a moment of triumph on behalf of all people when I walked onto the floor of Congress as a participant, not an observer. And then, of course, the talk of war. I told my friends and family that I would listen to arguments for the war. And if I could think of any reason to change my mind, I would. It's easy to stand up to militarists, but it's not easy to stand up to your family. And they didn't want me to make a needless sacrifice, as they said, because my vote wouldn't be the deciding vote. There were plenty of people clamoring for this war, but that's not the point of voting, is it? That you jump ship and go over to a side that's got the most people and vote that way? No. Having a voice and standing by what you believe, that's what voting is about. And if women are going to take their place as citizens in this country and have the vote, they have to understand that. So I knew that my vote that day would be a vote for women. So when the vote was called, now they take votes in Congress by roll call, and they call your name twice. So the first time I heard my name, Jeannette Rankin, I didn't say anything. A friend of our family, a former Speaker of the House, came over to my desk. He said, Jeannette, You can't afford not to vote. You represent the womanhood of the country. I can't tell you how to vote, but you must vote one way or the other according to your conscience. And so, the second time I heard my name, Jeannette Rankin, I want to stand by the country, but I cannot vote for war. I vote no. And I sat down. The voting continued. 373 for, 50 against, 9 not voting. My brother, Wellington, he'd come to Washington to be supportive, and he walked me home in the wee hours of the morning after that vote was finally taken, and he said, "You've done it. You won't be reelected." I told him I didn't care about that. I want to know what they'll say about me 50 years from now. And oh, the press. Didn't the press pick up on that vote? Jeannette Rankin, pawn of the Kaiser. Jeannette Rankin, member of the German army in the US. Jeannette Rankin, sentimental old fool. Jeannette Rankin, crying schoolgirl, unfit for public service. A disgrace. 49 other people voted no that day. Are they a disgrace too? Who are they? Do you know their names? Well, the voice of democracy had spoken. And so I worked for the draft and voted for the war bonds and worked to advance the cause of this country. But why did I go to Congress in the first place? To see the equal suffrage amendment passed. And to that end, there came an opportunity. Now, women had begun to picket the White House, and they were being attacked. They were being thrown into jail, force-fed when they went on a hunger strike to make their point. I distanced myself from that kind of negative activity because I felt I was there to represent all women. But truly, their bravery brought attention to this. And in the midst of all that was happening, the question of women's suffrage came to the floor of Congress in January of 1918. And I was ready. We, as a nation, were born in a land of unparalleled resources, with a people imbued with a buoyancy of youth and determination to make their dreams of freedom come true. But something is still missing. Babies are dying from cold and hunger. Soldiers are dying from lack of a woolen shirt. Could it not be that men who have spent their lives thinking in terms of commercial profits find it difficult to think in terms of human needs? And could it not be that the women of the country have something to offer at this time? We voted for this war, not state by state, but by federal action. Shall our women, our home defense, be the only fighters in the struggle for democracy who shall be denied federal action? How do we describe the meaning of democracy when a Congress that votes for a war to make the world safe for democracy denies this small measure of democracy to the women of the country? Women's suffrage passed then in the House, but it would be 2 years and 4 votes before it would pass in the Senate, and then another 9 months before it was ratified. And then in August of 1920, the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was added to the United States Congress in the same exact wording that Susan B. Anthony proposed 45 years earlier. Me, well, everyone was right. I was not reelected. I ran for Senate on a third-party ticket, but I wasn't successful there either. People said if I really had a party behind me, I'd be dangerous. Well, I don't want to be dangerous. I went to Europe, and women were not allowed to attend the peace talks at Versailles, but I traveled and I saw the devastation that was visited upon Europe because of that war. And every town I went to, every person I talked to, I see nothing has changed. There will be war as long as there are secret international agreements and governments that support private enterprises. So, what do I want? Well, I want to see women rise and take their place as leaders in the world. I want to see women and children protected by laws in this country. But most of all, I want to see the world at peace. Thank you. What next? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Mary Jane will be back in a minute. Oh my gosh. Let's see. Let me just change this. There we go. So, do we have any questions? And you can put your questions in the chat so we don't have a lot of you in your little box just waving your hand. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll see where we go with discussion. And if you don't have a place to go with it, I can contribute. This box right in the middle.
I just wanted to say that was great. I had to turn my camera off for a second when I teared up there. I loved it.
Well, I'm glad. And I think one of my, I first decided to portray Jeannette in 2003. I was living in Colorado and I had come to Montana on a vacation and went to the Historical Society, and on that landing that goes up to the next floor, there was her statue, and the docent was telling the story of this woman. And people ask me why I choose the people that I choose, and it's because something clicks. I have researched women whose stories I thought would be fascinating and whose costumes would be great. And I don't resonate with it. But Jeannette's story, I couldn't get to the gift shop fast enough to buy Norma Smith's biography of her and create the perspective. Yes, she's known for those no votes for the war, but she didn't get on that path to government because of pacifism. Some scholars say that the no vote she cast in 1917 set her on that path. Up to then, what was she about? She was about suffrage. She was about equality. And well, Jeannette once said, when you're first at something, you don't have anyone to show you what to do. You don't have anyone to point the way. And a woman in politics at that time had absolutely no role models at all. So while she might not have in her life learned enough about politics to stick with a career in it, she definitely made an impact with using her voice and her courage for standing by what she believed. For those of you, just a quick trajectory, she did not get reelected to Congress in 16, 17, 18. So she was out of Congress when the 19th Amendment was ratified and took hold. But she worked as a lobbyist for peace. That First World War was devastating, and no one ever wanted to see it again. There was a referendum put before our Congress to outlaw war as a way of solving problems. There was another one internally in our country that would put going to war to the voters. And of course, neither of those passed. But she lobbied for peace. She traveled throughout Europe. Once the 30s came and she could see what was happening in Germany and Italy, and how our own government was, she didn't care for Roosevelt, FDR. She did not like it. She thought he was channeling us towards this war with his various actions. And she thought, we can't go to war. The country doesn't want to go to war. And she came back to Montana in 1939, was elected again. So she was in Congress on December 8th, the day after December 7th, when a vote was called. That day, they only took one roll call. In 1917, there were 3 days of discussion before the vote was called. In 1941, there was 17 minutes of discussion before a one roll call vote was called, and she was the only no vote that day. She said, you can either be for war or against it, and I'm against it. All I have left, she said after that, when she was called much worse names than she was called the first time, she said, all I have left is my integrity. The rest of her life she spent as a lobbyist and involved in a number of women's peace movements. Of course, she lived through the Korean War, she lived through Vietnam, and led a group of protesters in 1968 on the Mall in Washington. She's 88 years old now, 5,000 women. And in some of my audiences over the years, there have been women who said they were there that day. And here's this tiny little woman charging up the mall, leading everybody at the age of 88. And she remained active in her voice against solving problems with violence all the way up until her death in 1973. So many dates. 2020 was such an interesting year. My content in my women's programs has not changed because those women's lives were not affected by 2020. But because of all of the awarenesses, all of the voices that have come to the surface in 2020, we now can take a life like this and expand it into discussion about what action can be taken going forward. So I'll be quiet. And
we do have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is from Kirby. She says, Mary Jane, as you know, Jeannette is one of 2 people representing Montana in Statuary Hall in the nation's capital. How do you think Jeannette Rankin would feel about that?
It's so interesting that Montana's 2 statues in Statuary Hall are Jeannette Rankin and Charlie Russell. Charlie Russell's the only artist in all 50 states who got to send 2 statues, but Jeannette didn't have a career in politics. And she was recognized, and I'm not sure when the legislature voted for her to be the 2nd statue, but that statue was dedicated in 1983. So 10 years after she was gone. I think, it's interesting. Jeannette didn't leave a lot of journals or personal reflections or anything like that. She was on a talk show one time, and she was asked, I think it was David Frost or something, and they asked her, what gave you that courage to do the things you did? That was very brave. And she said, I'm just stubborn. They expected some answer about maybe her faith or some other component that was deep down inside. She just said, I'm stubborn. And she said, if I had it to do over, I'd do the same things, only this time I would be nastier. And I don't think she meant nasty in the way of mean and cruel. I think she meant assertive and assertive and aggressive even about getting your voice heard. Pacifists were pacifists. They didn't do a lot of nonviolent resistance. And she very much supported Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. And she thought, and of course, their methods of nonviolent resistance turned out to be violent, but they got something done. Pacifists never really took that road. So what would she say? Wow, what a great question. Knowing her or feeling like I know her a little bit, I think she would probably just, I don't know that she'd gush and say, I'm deeply honored. Maybe deep down inside, she would think, well, maybe if I stood for something and that standing for something has been honored, then that is worth it.
Okay, and our next question is from Karen. She'd like you to know that she so loved this. I get what she's saying. I did too. And well, how long do you, at that time, was a trip from Montana to Washington?
Oh, interesting. Well, yes. When she campaigned, you're talking about 1917. So
I'm gonna guess. Karen, if you have any other feedback, feel free to type it in.
well, think about 1916 when she was campaigning here in Montana. There was a lot of dirt roads, a lot of horse and buggy, I would imagine, a lot of trains going from place to place so that she could get to the voters and make sure that, they got her message. She loved driving a car. She always had a car, a vehicle, an automobile. And I think it was probably maybe more than a week to get from Montana to Washington in those days, just because of the conditions of the roads. And I kind of think of Montana in those days, maybe dirt and gravel and not a lot of pavement. And think about, you have to go through Wyoming and South Dakota and all kinds of places. I would guess that's something I could research, is her car route across country. But yes, she very much was an independent, I'm going to get there kind of person. I'm sure if she took a train, it would be faster. I think train was probably 3 to 4 days in those days.
Yes, Karen was asking about 1916-17, how long it took to get from here to Washington, D.C.
I want to just add, just make a comment on the women's movement. We've been inundated this last year with a lot of vocal people. Some of it voices we haven't heard from. There's a lot of good stuff percolating, and as change comes to the surface, of course, there's people that are have different opinions about that change. The suffragists that started in 1848 with that Seneca Falls meeting wanted equality. They wanted equal rights. They wanted a voice. They felt that the voice in government would give them much more of a chance to see some of the reforms and the equity that they wanted in our society. But it wasn't the same kind of equality that the 1960s feminists were after, at least on the surface. The original suffragists, that first wave of suffragists, they knew men and women were different. They didn't expect that men and women would do the same jobs or have the same roles. Women's role was pretty much to be with the family, but they wanted women to have a choice. They said, we want that perspective. You remember that book, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, about the differences in how men and women show up and communicate? And that's what they understood without the book to tell them. Men and women are different. There was one book that really influenced Jeannette by Benjamin Kidd, The Power of Force and Force of Power. And the difference between those two, force is punching somebody in a nose who punches you in the nose, and you just punch back and forth, which is not very productive and useful in coming to an agreement. Power is looking at the situation, fixing it permanently through negotiations or changes that take place without violence. And that was the difference, she believed, in how men and women see the world. And those two perspectives are what we need in our government, in our decision making. Is this perspective and that perspective. And between the two, we're going to come up with a solution, not just having one point of view to go forward. When the 1960s roll around, we've come out of the Second World War, and women who have been working now don't have jobs anymore, and they're told to go home and get the doldrums of the 1950s, where there wasn't a lot of activity for women. And then the 60s come around, and I can see by some of the pictures that some of you lived through that. That was a more militant feminist movement. And honestly, I didn't want to be thought of as a feminist, a bra-burning, marching, screaming, banshee kind of a woman. I didn't want to be a feminist if that's what feminism was. So they wanted equality. I want to be just like a man. I want the same jobs. I want the same opportunities. It still comes down to choice. But it was done in such a way that it looked like women wanted to push men aside. And that's not what the original suffragists wanted. So taking a look at how we change in our hearts and minds over time, in how we show up and how we advance our causes is a piece of this. So now the 1960s, 70s, think of the pushback in the 70s, the Phyllis Schlafly movement. And if you haven't seen that, Mrs. America, you must look at that, because that was a real pushback. So now here we are, 2020, and we have, lots of activity with voices coming to the surface. So I guess we just keep evolving, but knowing the history, knowing where some of these mindsets have come from. And then, of course, within all of our lifetimes now, we have generations that have lived through so much change that they have their own mindsets. It's like the jokes about the older generation picking up technology and trying to keep up with all the languages and all the music and such, that it's just going really fast right now. But we hang on to our hearts. Any other questions? And about Jeannette, perhaps? Has anyone here seen or heard of the musical Jeannette? Jeannette, a musical is what it's called. No? No people tapping in? It's unique. The woman who developed it was played Eliza Hamilton in the Chicago version of Hamilton, the musical. And she's a remarkable musician and has written some remarkable songs about Jeannette and the activities of her life. And it's not just a chronology, really. It's a lot of little moments in Jeannette's life, turning points that, of course, with license, poetic license and research and, condensing some of the history, it's come out to be the story. It's interesting. I'm not a fan of all of the choices that they've made, but a Jeannette musical? Ask me, or ask yourselves, what would Jeannette think of that on Broadway with lots of production numbers? Be interesting to watch that and see how it comes to fruition. Any other questions or comments?
No, Karen just says, yes, it's quite fabulous. A different Karen.
The musical?
I believe the musical, yes.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I mean, again, from going from two lines in most history books to having an entire production that think of the people who will know about this woman's life once that becomes fully fleshed out and produced.
And Melissa, yes, the recording will be available. I'm going to admit I didn't start it till right as Mary Jane was starting her reenactment. So we might have missed the first 2 seconds or so. And so the introduction isn't in the recording, and I apologize for that. That's on me. But we did get the whole reenactment and the Q&A at the end, and that will be available to watch. I think the plan is to post it on the Historical Society website. Is that right, John? You can just nod.
Yeah, it'll either be ICCW or Montana Historical Society. Kirby, I'll get with you afterwards and we can talk about that as well. But either way, we'll make sure the word gets out on where it is posted so everybody will have access to it.
Or I'm guessing you all got a pop-up when I started it asking if you assented to still be in the presentation. And so whenever you got that little pop-up is when the recording started.
Right.
Oh, that's what that box was. I didn't know what I was supposed to do with it, so I just left it there.
All right. Any
Well,
additional-
I just think in closing,
Yeah.
these women's stories are so important to know our history, to know a little background about what is especially going on now around us, and the opportunities we have to chime in and to use our own voices. It's important to keep the stories alive, and the nurturing that we can do in any capacity, whether we have children and grandchildren, helping them understand that an open mind and an open heart. You know, Jeannette, she was a humanitarian to her core. And scholars and critics say she wasn't successful in politics. She had two-year stints in Congress, and she could have had like a lifetime career in Congress, maybe, if she'd known more about how to make relationships and how to work with people. But it doesn't mean she didn't understand the heart of people. So one story that I particularly like, when suffrage was trying to pass in Congress, so January of 1918 to January of 1920, it failed in the Senate three times. Finally, the fourth vote, they passed it. And there was one particularly powerful and strong voice against it. It was a Senator Walsh from Massachusetts. And so Jeannette went to Boston and she gave a speech. And she had lots of people listening. She said, you know, your senator is a really good man. There's only one thing wrong with him. He doesn't believe in women's suffrage. And that's your fault. You haven't told him how you feel. Well, his office was inundated with letters and telegrams and phone calls and just, get up, get with the program. You got to vote for it. Well, he didn't want to, but she went to him and she said, look, I know you don't want to vote for this, but if you can't vote for it, at least don't vote against it. And he didn't. So she knew how to reach people. She knew how to relate. Her entire life was devoted to bettering conditions for women and children who didn't have a lot of support. And I think that's an important aspect to her story, that beyond the 2 no votes, she needs to be recognized for. So thank you, and thank you, John, and thank you, Kirby. Thank you, Montana Historical Society. And I will look forward, I hope, to seeing you all in a couple of weeks with a different story up my sleeve.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you very much, Mary Jane. We really appreciate it. As always, great having you with us. And thank you to my coworker, Lisa Culligan. She is always awesome for being there for us to support us on the Zoom side of it and to get things running smoothly and recording. So thank you, Lisa. And again, thank you, Kirby, and to the Montana Historical Society as well for always supporting us and being a part of this with us every year. So it means a big difference to us and means a lot to us. So thank you very much for that. And as Mary Jane said, she will be joining us back in 2 weeks. looking at the schedule right now. So next week, basically same time as I said earlier, 11 to 12. We're going to have Cassie Parr from Helena giving us lessons on leadership. And if you're not familiar with Cassie, we're hoping to get her bio and some additional information out soon on that. But just Google Cassie. She has just been an amazing leader in the Helena community. So, and that's all I'm going to say is just Google Cassie Parr Helena, and you'll see some of the great things that she's done and involved in. And then again, Mary Jane on the 24th of March, same time, 11 to 12. And she's going to do a reenactment of Nancy Cooper Russell. As many of you know her as the wife of Charles M. Russell, or Charlie Russell. And then finally, at the end of the month, we're going to have Misty Cool, the Director of Office of Indian Affairs, and she's going to do a presentation on celebrating American Indian women. So still lots to come here during the month of March, and we'll hope you'll take the time to join us. And again, it's the same Zoom link that we used today for all of the events. So we look forward to seeing you in the next coming weeks. Thank you.